He locked the door before she'd even finished carrying the second garbage bag to the curb. My name is Naomi Reyes. I'm 29. On a Sunday afternoon in March, my mother-in-law stood in my own driveway and told me I had 20 minutes to get my 6-month-old son out of the house I'd paid half the mortgage on for 4 years. My husband Dean stood behind her, arms crossed, and said one sentence I will never forget. My mother's right. This was never really your house anyway. I didn't argue. I picked up my son, walked to my car, and started making calls before I even left the driveway. They had no idea what house I actually owned. I want to back up, because that sentence, "This was never really your house," didn't come from nowhere. Dean and I bought our house in Tulsa in 2021. I was a structural engineer at a mid-size firm. He managed a used car lot his father had started. My income was steadier than his most years, and I'd covered more than my share of the mortgage more than once when his commissions dried up. His mother, Carol, had never liked me. She called me practical, the way some people call a woman cold. She thought I'd married Dean for stability he didn't actually have, which was almost funny, considering how often my paycheck was the stability. The affair wasn't a surprise by the time it happened. Not really. I'd noticed the late nights, the phone turned face down, the sudden gym membership. What surprised me was who it was with. Dean's business partner's wife, Priscilla, a woman who'd sat across from me at 4 different Thanksgivings. I found out on a Tuesday in February when Priscilla's husband called me directly, voice shaking, and asked if I knew where our spouses actually were that weekend they'd both claimed to be at separate work conferences. I didn't scream. I didn't confront Dean that night. I'd learned a long time ago, watching my own parents' marriage dissolve into shouting matches neither of them won, that the person who stays calm is the person who keeps their options. So I said nothing. I opened our joint bank account statements instead. That's where I found the first real problem. Over the previous 8 months, Dean had transferred $11,000 out of our joint savings into an account I didn't recognize, always in amounts just under the threshold that would trigger a bank alert. I traced the account to a rental property listing, a furnished condo 12 minutes from Priscilla's gym. He'd been paying for the apartment where they met, out of money that was supposed to be our son's college fund. I didn't confront him with that either. I photographed every statement and forwarded them to an email address only I could access. The second thing I found was worse. Carol had been quietly involved in the mortgage paperwork on our house from the very beginning, something I'd never fully understood at the time because Dean handled his side of the closing and I handled mine. Going back through the original documents, I found that Carol had co-signed a private loan that covered our down payment, structured as a family loan rather than a gift, with a clause I'd genuinely forgotten existed. If the marriage ended due to infidelity or misconduct by either party, the loan converted into a lien against the property, repayable to Carol before any equity split. Dean had signed it without reading past the first page, eager to get the down payment fast and stop hearing his mother complain about renting. Carol had drafted that clause herself, years before there was ever a Priscilla, because she'd never trusted the marriage to last. She just hadn't expected it to work in anyone's favor but her own. I sat with that discovery for 3 days before I understood what it actually meant. Carol wasn't protecting her son. She was protecting her claim on a house she never legally lived in. The third piece came from Priscilla's husband, Marcus, the man who'd first called me. He'd hired a private investigator before I had, and he shared what he'd found in exchange for what I had. Dean and Priscilla weren't just seeing each other. They were planning to combine resources into a new car lot venture using capital from both marriages, timed to launch right after both divorces finalized, using Dean's father's original business license, still technically in Carol's name since her husband's death. Carol knew about the affair. Carol had known for months. She'd been helping them plan the business exit the entire time, which explained exactly why she suddenly wanted me out of a house she had a financial claim on. I didn't answer any of Dean's texts that week. He assumed my silence meant I hadn't figured anything out. He kept talking. He told a mutual friend I was checked out of the marriage emotionally and had been difficult to live with since the baby. He didn't know I'd have every one of those conversations relayed back to me within hours. Evidence doesn't need volume, it only needs time. The day Carol threw our things onto the driveway, she believed she was ending something. She didn't know I'd spent the previous 6 weeks meeting with a real estate attorney about the lien clause, and that my attorney had already confirmed something Carol herself seemed to have forgotten. The loan document required repayment upon divorce due to misconduct, but it said nothing about who retained ownership of the house itself. Under Oklahoma law, and under the actual language Carol had drafted, My name was still fully on the deed. Carol's lien gave her a financial claim to be repaid. It gave her no right to remove anyone from the property, let alone a 6-month-old baby. I stood in that driveway holding my son, and I let Dean finish his sentence. I let Carol enjoy the moment. Then I said, calmly, "You should probably call your lawyer before you change the locks again." Dean laughed. Carol didn't. 2 days later, my attorney sent formal notice to both of them. Any attempt to bar me or my son from the marital residence would constitute unlawful exclusion, actionable in both the divorce proceedings and potentially as a separate civil matter. Attached was a copy of the deed. Attached was a copy of the loan agreement Carol herself had written. Attached was a timeline of the bank transfers to the rental condo, cross-referenced with dates from Marcus's investigator. Dean called 11 times that day. I didn't answer. I forwarded every voicemail to my attorney, unlistened. The locks were changed back within the week, this time by court order, with a temporary occupancy ruling in my favor while the divorce proceeded. Dean moved into the rental condo, the one purchased with money from our son's college fund, now formally documented as a marital asset subject to division. Carol's lien was upheld. She was entitled to repayment, but only from Dean's share of the equity, since the clause never named me as the party at fault. The misconduct, as the record now clearly showed, had been entirely his. The business venture collapsed before it started. Marcus, once he had everything he needed for his own divorce, pulled his backing and the car lot's original license, threatening to report the informal ownership transfer to the state, given Carol's continued involvement, despite her son's business partner suing for breach of a non-compete. Carol found herself facing legal fees she hadn't budgeted for, trying to defend a lien she'd once believed was foolproof, now being used against the very son she'd built it to protect. The final hearing was in September. Dean sat across the room in a suit that looked borrowed. He didn't look at his mother once. When the judge reviewed the finalized settlement, the house remained mine, the lien satisfied out of Dean's diminished share, and primary custody of our son awarded to me, with Dean granted supervised parenting time, pending a full review given the documented pattern of financial concealment. Outside the courthouse, Dean tried one last time. "I didn't think you'd actually fight for any of it." I looked at him and said, "I didn't fight for it. I just read the paperwork you didn't." He had nothing to say to that. Carol never apologized. She sent one message, months later, asking to see her grandson. I didn't block her. I simply told her that door would open on its own schedule, not hers, and that trust, like everything else in that family, apparently needed to be documented before it meant anything. My son turned 1 this spring. We had the party in the backyard of the house that's still, legally and otherwise, mine. I stood on the porch that evening, the same spot where Carol once told me I had 20 minutes, and I understood something I hadn't fully let myself feel until then. They thought throwing me out would end the story. They never once stopped to read what they'd actually signed. If you found out the family you married into had built a claim on your life without your knowledge, would you have confronted them the moment you found out, or would you have waited, quietly, until the paperwork did the talking for you?